one of the things that came up and was a huge talking point the last time we spoke was violence is violence. And that subject came up because we were talking about how even though boxing has nothing to do with grappling, I've met some boxers that because of their combat sports experience that they've done really well when transitioning into grappling and jiu-jitsu specifically. And you made the point that, violence is violence. And, what can you kind of elaborate more on that? Because I know what you mean, but it's kind of a deep subject.
Yeah, and I mean it in like a really overly broad way that I'm sure I'm going to get some pushback on. But in terms of like it's competitive, zero sum context where there's a lot on the line and there are similarities between those, no matter how high you go. So, like, if you're down to a fist fight, there are first principles there, and those first principles will still apply to like country on country warfare, oftentimes. Because like, and to give an example, there's this idea in warfare between maneuver and attrition. Like, do you want to win by like outmaneuvering your opponent, encircling them, cutting off the head of the snake, and via maneuver? Or do you want to win by attrition, by like whittling down their resources and kind of being the last man standing? And there's a lot of back and forth reason. This is not like a settled thing in the military science field, but what it seems to me is, yeah, maneuver is great if you can do it, because it's the same. It is the same thing in martial arts. Where do you want to win with a quick knockout, or do you want to just slowly beat them down over the course of the fight until they have no defense left?
You could also make the comparison. See, you're comparing attrition to, like you said, a slow beatdown, and maneuvering as a quick and decisive knockout. Whereas when you said that, I imagined it as the maneuvering is more akin to just general technique in combat sports. And the attrition part is like your cardio, your preparation, like how much energy do you have? How much weight did you cut going into that? And how can you outdo your opponent in that sense?
Yeah, the attrition is very much what is your cardio and how much damage can you take and still be standing kind of deal. But then, like the maneuver being the individual techniques, that is basically it. Because, like, in grappling, do you want to like slowly grind your opponent down until they're just exhausted, or do you just want to snap on a choke? You want to snap on a choke. If you're boxing, you want to just quick head duck and knock them out. Like, ideally, that's great. But the only way that that works reliably is when you dramatically outmatch your opponent. That's the only time you can do that. And what we can see throughout history and like a lot of the 20th century and whatnot is in the late 20th century, America adopted a maneuver-based doctrine. And we did that because we so overmatched everyone we were fighting that, yeah, of course we could. We could just win via maneuver. But when someone has good defense and a good chin and they're strong, you might, quick move your head and get that punch in, and they're still standing. And you might do it again. You might hit them, and they're still standing. And in close fights, it is an attrition fight, whether you like it or not, no matter how bad you want maneuver to work. And that's how it applies in hand-to-hand combat and warfare. Because, like, if you're going into an MMA fight, the worst thing that can happen to you is you gas out. That's the nightmare scenario and
terrifying. Yes.
Yeah, your number one priority, and every coach understands this. Preparing their students for combat sports is you have to not gas out. Your nightmare scenario is gassing out, and in warfare, your nightmare scenario is not being able to equip your soldiers. It's a failure of logistics, a failure of attrition, or a failure of political will. It's something breaking down that does not allow your tactics to work.
It's interesting. That's an interesting point that you make with warfare, because to your point, most wars are fought in the 20th century as a maneuvering based strategy because it's usually big country versus small country. at least in the case of the United States. Whereas when you look at, say, medieval warfare, for example, it almost always came down to a war of attrition, because somebody would lock themselves in a castle and you would have to sit outside their gates until they starved to death. And it was always that battle of attrition, you know.
For siege warfare, yeah, because that's the thing. Like, you have to dramatically outmatch your enemy in firepower. If you go up to a castle wall with bows and arrows and maybe some sieging implements, it's going to be an attrition fight. Now, if you go up against a castle wall with an F-35 and some ballistic missiles, yeah, you can win via maneuver. That'll be pretty easy.
I thought you were going to go more in chronological order, you know, like with a cannon.
I skipped some steps.
right to the fighter jets.
Yeah.
So those are some examples of the similarities when it comes to warfare and combat sports. What do you think is like the main difference between warfare and combat sports, other than the obvious, you know, like dying?
There are obviously plenty of differences, and it depends on where you draw lines. Because my first instinct is to say like the levels of warfare, because there are the tactics, there's the operational level, and then there's the strategic level and the grand strategic level, which is like, you know, guy on the ground with a rifle, you're not thinking about the strategic level, you are thinking about tactics kind of deal. But like the general in the Pentagon back home, you are not thinking how or when to fire your rifle, you're thinking about strategy. But even then with fighting, like you can still draw similarities to hand-to-hand combat. Like the guy in the cage throwing the punches is thinking about what move he has to do. The guy that was training him 6 months ago is thinking about game plan and overall skill building and strategy and conditioning.
That's fair.
So, yeah.
Let me take a try at this one because it's something I have thought about. I would say that the main difference between combat sports, or let's just call it mutually agreed upon combat, and warfare, is ambush. Ambush is different than taking your opponent by surprise, because you can do that in a combat sports fight. You know, you could do something that they didn't expect you to do, but at least in a combat sports fight or a mutually agreed upon fight, you know you're in a fight. You know that the guy is going to try to commit violence in you. Whereas an ambush is coming up upon somebody that has no idea that there's about to be a fight. You know, they may make preparations and you know, set up defensive perimeters or whatever the case may be, but there's a chance that they could be caught completely unawares and find themselves in a fight for their lives, you know?
See, and
I was wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, because I would think about that a little bit differently, just because like the fighter is the individual in the fight, and then you're thinking about it from an individual soldier in the battle space being ambushed, where you're suddenly in a fight. But I like comparing the fighter to a soldier is really freaking hard, because the fight is the war. So if you think about the army as the fighter, then you're getting surprised in one tiny little piece. So that's essentially the same as having your guard slightly out of position.
That's fair. That's fair.
Yeah.
And I suppose it's really difficult to make the comparison sometimes, because warfare is so compartmentalized. You know, there's so many different facets to it, so many different ranks involved with the entire operation.
Top-down level is really freaking hard, because I've been trying to get a good view of it for at least a few years now. I've been trying to like read lectures and articles from people that actually know what they're talking about to genuinely understand it. And it's complicated, and you almost have to focus in on specific elements just to hold the whole thing in your head. But like a violence is violence concept that'll probably be like really easy to intuitively understand is like cage controlling the arena. If you watch a fight, if you watch a snapshot of a fight, and one guy's back against the fence and the other guy is standing in the middle, who's probably winning the fight 9 times out of 10?
Well, it's the guy pushing the pace, so the guy in the middle. Yeah.
The guy in the middle, right. And if you look at a chess match and white pieces are scattered over like 3/4 of the board and the black pieces are condensed in 1/4 of the board, who's probably winning that chess match right now?
It's probably the white pieces because they're
Probably,
surrounding the black. Yes.
yeah, it's probably the white pieces. And if you look at a battle space and one country and like neither country had default control of the battle space, they both came in and one country controls 3/4 of the map and the other country controls 1/4 of the map, who's probably winning? It's the same freaking
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, things like maneuver versus attrition or area control or, tactical surprise or things like that are translate weirdly well between completely disparate violent encounters. And I realized this once I tried to just keep expanding my scope, because my channel is armchair violence instead of armchair martial arts. And I'm trying to slowly branch out into more and more aspects of violence. And the more I learn about them, the more similarities I see of just, when humans are competing in a zero-sum context, whether it's a fight, a war, or a game of checkers, they keep doing the same freaking things.
Well, yeah, in terms of strategy and, the overall just act of violence, yes. What I would say is another main difference that you could make the argument that they're similar to, but I would say another main difference is warfare is technology driven. Mm-hmm. The better technology is not only going to win the war, but it is going to change how the war is fought. And when you look at any kind of weapon, that it's a form of technology, as something as simple as a stick, a pointy stick, and a nuclear bomb. They are technology, they are a tool to commit violence. And combat sports is not driven by that whatsoever. They have equipment and stuff like that. Yeah.
Unless you allow steroids, and then it basically is.
Yeah. I mean, some people might.
Yeah. And of course, things like chess are not driven by technology. Mm-hmm. But things like combat sports and chess, that's mainly just because we artificially limited it. We made rules that said no technology.
Yes.
Yeah. So, because otherwise you absolutely would employ technology.
So would you say there's more rules in combat sports than there is warfare? Because there's rules to warfare, of course, but
that's a good question, actually. On paper, if you compare unified rules of MMA to warfare, there's way more rules in warfare. It's not even freaking close. There's just documents and documents and conventions after convention on warfare. And then it also gets way more complex because certain countries have signed on to certain things that other countries have not signed on to. So every country is kind of operating under slightly different rules.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would be as if in the UFC, if each fight was governed by rules that those two fighters agreed to 10 years ago.
Or you could also make the comparison of how the unified rules of MMA are not unified at all.
Yeah,
across different countries and even across different states.
Yeah. They almost were unified for a while, at least in the US, and then they ununified them again.
Yeah, because they wanted to change more stuff, which I agreed with the changes that they wanted to make. I didn't agree with how they made the changes, but perhaps that's another topic for another video. But
you also did bring up an interesting point of which one has more rules. And I feel like that's a question of how do we measure it? Because which one has more rules or which one has the most restrictive rules?
Yeah, the most limiting. Yeah.
Yeah, because if you just say no weapons, that's only one rule. All right. Warfare has to they have no this weapon and no this weapon and no this weapon. They have 17 rules, but they have 1,500 other weapons that are allowed because there aren't specific rules against them. So that is pick how you measure it thing.
Right. Well, I guess you have to decide which combat sport we're talking about, right? Because if we're just talking about jiu-jitsu, that is an extremely liberating combat sport in the sense of grappling, because there's not many grappling techniques that are not allowed. But in the terms of striking, it's extremely limiting because you cannot
just
strike.
no strikes.
Yeah, no strikes.
Yeah.
And to your point, that's basically like saying no weapons.
Yeah.
A little bit of current event time, I think, and it's just because it's so interesting. There is something going on in Kashmir, I believe, or the region where India meets China. And you've got two big nuclear superpowers that are fighting over land in close proximity. So I don't know if the rule is spoken or unspoken, but they have elected to kill each other with clubs and rocks.
Yeah,
which is so fascinating. It's terrible, but it's fascinating.
Weapons on that border. Yeah, both countries agreed to not put weapons on that border, to not inflame tensions, and now they're hitting each other with sticks. And that is absolutely hilarious to me.
How far we've come.
Yeah. So like I'm waiting for HEMA to make that kind of comeback right on that India-China border.
Yes.
Since they banned firearms, I want to see someone coming in there with a halberd. That'll be incredible.
Bring on the claymores.
but a different claymore than the boom kind.